Welcome to Law Talk with Peter Meyer.
Hello and welcome to Law Talk with Peter Meyer. Peter provides personalized and professional representation for personal injury and wrongful death cases across Georgia, empowering injured individuals to recover financially and hold those responsible accountable. I am your host, Kevin Rosenquist, and today we're going to talk about navigating the complexities of multi-vehicle car wrecks. Peter, great to see you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks. It's great to be here, Kevin.
So what is it that makes cases with multiple defendants like multi-vehicle car wrecks more complex to handle compared to single car or single defendant accidents?
Well, first, the obvious thing is establishing who's at fault. If you have three vehicles involved and everybody's pointing the finger at one another, figure out which one, and sometimes it's more than one, who's at fault. And that brings up some changes in the law in Georgia over the last few years when you have multiple parties allegedly at fault to some degree or less or more. And so the law changed from what it used to be joint and several, where we could just get a verdict against all of them and pick who we wanted to collect from. But now it's changed in Georgia to an apportionment law where we have to actually set a percentage for each defendant. If you go to trial, the jury verdict form has a defendant and a percentage, and they will fill in who's responsible for each percentage. And so, when we try a case like that, we need to make sure that we, know who we're going after and what our theory is for liability on, in some cases, multiple defendants. One may be speeding, one may be, ran the light, one, whatever it is. And a big issue with the new apportionment of liability in Georgia is that you have to make sure that we include all potential defendants, because now the defense can give notice 120 days before trial and point the finger at an unnamed defendant. And that's the last thing you want to have, is where you're at trial and they're pointing at an empty chair and saying that person is 100% or 80% responsible for this accident. Mm-hmm. So you need to make sure that you have all your ducks in a row and have done all of your prep work to establish exactly what happened and who's responsible.
It seems like it would be more difficult to figure out fault because there's so many people involved. Does the way you go about determining fault and figuring out liability, do your methods change?
Basically, it's the same process. We're doing the detective work in the beginning, and, it boils down to what the evidence is. All of the drivers, the passengers, the witnesses, dash cameras, traffic cameras, police reports, and in some cases, bringing in our own expert reconstructionist. You need to do all of that. And, just in my opinion, just keep an open mind, because facts change. Sometimes you think you know what happened until you do all of that. And you're like, oh my God, this person was really at fault. So it just creates more work, but the type of detective work is exactly the same.
You mentioned dash cams. I was curious, are you seeing dash cams more often now? Are they becoming more of a more prevalent?
Oh yeah. Dash cameras are our best friend, and it is becoming more prevalent. I wish everybody had them. And we just had a case recently involving an intersection collision, and the defendant worked for a dealership and was test driving a vehicle. And his first reaction was to try to say, oh, no, I didn't, fail to yield. But our client had the dash camera, so it was clear as day. And if they didn't, it would have been one person's word versus another. I think everybody should have one in their car.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've heard people say that before. I don't have one, but I'm thinking about it. I mean, it's not a bad investment.
No, they're relatively cheap, and they're really great cameras. I think it's a great idea for everybody. Commercial vehicles, it's required in most of them. So we have that in trucking cases, but your day-to-day car accident cases, and we all see these wild videos online. It's important sometimes to have that documentation.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt. So can you kind of walk us through the process of gathering evidence in a multi-vehicle accident? What are the key factors that you focus on?
Well, time is always of the essence, especially if there's a dispute about liability, because if you don't prove liability, you don't even get to damages. So you want to get to the scene and the vehicles and the witnesses as soon as possible. Get the police video. A lot of times that reveals things when the officer has their camera on and they're interviewing people, or even just recording the scene. They'll take recording of some of the evidence disappears by the time they hire us. So all of that needs to be done as soon as possible. We've won cases based on the roadway evidence, skid marks, or where debris is placed. or the damage to the vehicles. We've gone to record yards and documented damage to vehicles, and later on said, oh, there's the piece of evidence that shows exactly how this happened. And so that has to all be done as soon as possible. That's the most important thing before that evidence disappears.
Yeah, I could see that. Yeah, those kind of things. And then what about like, do you look around for businesses that might have cameras? I mean, do you just sort of like have to like, I don't know, just sort of take in the scene and figure out the best way to go about it?
Well, I mean, we have had cases that turned out to be crucial evidence. We had a wrongful death case that was actually captured on a Ring doorbell camera from a camera across the street.
Oh, wow.
And that it was shocking to see, but that was, that enabled us to settle that case versus having to go through a long drawn out trial.
Wow, that's interesting. A Ring camera. Wow,
Yes,
that's
yes.
crazy.
I've also had it happen where there was a bar camera. I had a case here in Macon, Georgia, where there was a dispute about who was at fault. And there was a bar right across the street, and they had a security camera, and it caught the defendant pulling out. You couldn't see the wreck, but you could see where they pulled out, that you could hear the wreck. So it was clearly shown that they failed to yield.
Okay. Yeah, it was clear that they were not telling the truth on that one. Interesting stuff. Is it difficult handling these cases because all the parties are going to have their own attorneys? Does it become contentious because of that?
It can. It just depends on the facts. There are cases where we, there'll be 2 or 3 of us representing different parties, and we may essentially agree about who is at fault, and we'll collaborate. And then there's cases where you just have to fight it out amongst each other. And once again, that's something that a good plaintiff's lawyer will do early and not in the presence of the jury if they can avoid it.
Mm-hmm.
Insurance companies love to sit back at trial and let the 2 parties fight it out. So a smart lawyer will do that as much as possible well before you get there.
Speaking of insurance companies, how do they handle multi-car wrecks? Because there's so many people involved, obviously insurance companies don't want to pay if they don't have to. So how does that process sort of play out?
Well, insurance companies love to be able to point the finger at anybody else other than their insured. So they really enjoy a good multi-car pileup because, that just, as I said a minute ago, that allows them to point the finger at anyone else other than their driver. And so, that's another reason why we want to do all of our investigative work as soon as possible and talk to all the witnesses and all the occupants as soon as possible. If somebody's represented, I'll contact their lawyer and say, hey, what are you hearing about this? And as I said, most of the time when you do your detective work early on, you can, figure these issues out before you have to do it before a jury. And then the insurance company doesn't get to sit back and try to just point the finger at someone else.
Mm-hmm. How do you negotiate in order to get the fair compensation for your client? If there's multiple people involved, is there like a percentage of liability that gets allocated if it's not 100% one person's fault? How does that work?
Well, now that Georgia has changed to an apportionment state, you do have to determine a percentage for each at-fault party. And so I've had cases where we had 2 defendants and it was 50-50. I've had 2 cases where we had 2 defendants and it was, like 85-15. If you're negotiating that, then that's just a matter of presenting the evidence that I discussed earlier. And if you're at trial, you suggest to the jury, here's the evidence and here's what we think, but ultimately it's their decision and they will put a percentage for each one. I had the very first case I tried was 2 drivers pointing the finger at each other. And by the time we got most way through the trial, I decided to ask the jury to put all of the damages on one party because he was so obviously lying about the accident. And the jury did. They gave 100% against one and the other one walked away scot-free as he should have.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing because it's they're just weighing it and putting a percentage on it. I mean, as a jury, how do you even come up with the percentage, or do you get coached a little bit?
No, I mean, it's our role to present the evidence and then our interpretation of the evidence and then to argue for our client what we think the best outcome is. But juries will do their own thing sometimes. And so, I like to say here, this is why we're making this argument. This is why I think it should be this percentage, but ultimately it's your choice. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that's not so easy. But that's why these cases are complex and why insurance companies like them.
Yeah. So when you have somebody who may not be completely not at fault, do you have to then kind of, figure out where your compensation should lie and obviously you always want to do best by your client, but I imagine that can get difficult for you too, because you have to be realistic, but you also want to get as much as you can for your client.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, Kevin, because many times they will allege that our client is partially at fault, or sometimes they'll say totally at fault.
Mm-hmm.
And the law in Georgia is what they call a modified comparative negligence state. So what they say is if my client is assessed to be a percentage at fault, say 25%, their damages will be reduced by 25%. And that can go up to 49%. But if both parties are 50-50, neither party can recover against the other for anything.
Mm-hmm.
So my client can essentially have their damages reduced as much as 49% or completely erased if it's determined to be 50-50. And that's something we see a lot when you have one person driving one car, one person driving another, no witnesses, and they each say they had the green light. And I've had that case many times.
Yeah. Yeah, that's that. Because even if someone's not lying, you probably think you're right. In a lot of those situations. I mean, sometimes there's going to be people lying, but I think a lot of times, like you just, I don't know, you're
You
so
have to
used to
look.
driving.
Yeah, you have to look for the little things. Like the last
Yeah.
case I had, where each person said they had the right of way. There was a little mention by the other driver about something about having food in his car, and then we went out to the scene and we saw that he had some drinks and food splattered in his car. And then I asked him, were you eating or drinking? And then his lawyer hated this, but he said, "Oh yeah, I had just reached for my soda." And then I looked up, and then that car was there. So
Oops.
something as small as that can make the difference, because my client would have gotten nothing if it was 50-50. We have the burden of proof, so we have to show
Yeah.
that they were responsible.
Right.
So you can see why when they allege our client is responsible, it can be an all or nothing thing, literally.
For sure. So does this doesn't only apply this sort of concept of multiple people of liability. It's not only car wrecks, correct?
Absolutely not. It does apply to other cases, and it's really important. We see it a lot in premises liability cases. So if somebody is injured in a business or a residence or some other premises, it's very common to not know when they come see us who exactly is responsible. We've had a case that comes to mind where my client had a spinal fracture. She was working I won't name names, she was working in a business in a big mall type of structure, and there was a roof that was leaking, and she slipped and broke her some lumbar vertebrae, pretty serious injury.
Oh, that sounds awful.
Yeah. Oh, so painful. And first you think, okay, she works for this company. Well, they're not responsible for the roof. Well, it's owned by this company, but they have a management company. And the management company said, well, we've used roofing companies. So we sued the owners, the management company, and 2 or 3 roofers who we knew had worked on the place. And through the extensive work process of discovery, we were able to, request invoices and requests for repairs and so forth. And long story short, the reality came out that the owners opted to never really fix it. They opted to do patchwork, and this leak had been going on for a long time, so they knew it was dangerous. They just didn't want to spend the money. So we dismissed the roofers. We dismissed, and dismissed the management company. It was the owner that was responsible. But we only knew that because we had to go through the process of investigating 2 roofers, and management, and the owners.
In that situation, do you sue all these different people just so that you can make sure, and for the discovery and for all that stuff, so that you can get all the information you need?
I prefer not to if we don't have to, but sometimes we can only get those documents when we're in litigation. So in that case, the insurance company for the owner who ultimately paid for this serious injury, they were denying responsibility altogether. And they were saying the roofer's responsible. They didn't fix it. We paid them to go out there. So we had to include them because otherwise they could have pointed to an empty chair if we didn't sue the roofers. And so, but before it got to trial, we learned all of this, and we went ahead and I dismissed all those other defendants. And that case, they settled a very large settlement the day of trial, as a matter of fact.
Wow. Talk about waiting till the last minute, huh?
Well, that's their job, is to avoid paying.
Right. That's true.
Yeah.
That's very true. What about what would you say is one of the most significant multi-car wreck cases that you've had that kind of stands out, where you had to really fight to get your client the compensation that they deserved?
Well, there's a couple. I mean, it's interesting because the very first case I ever tried a long time ago was a multiple rear-end collision case, and where parties were pointing the fingers at each other. This was down in Houston County, Georgia, and there were I think three drivers initially, and then but by the time we filed suit, we knew that it was only between two. And I mentioned this a moment ago. This was a case where, as the trial went along, it became so clearly evident that one driver was not telling the truth. The story was inconsistent, and the property damage showed that he hit my client first. He was trying to say he was hit and knocked into my client. So between his testimony and the physical evidence to the vehicles, that's one where I asked the jury to don't even allocate between these two. This person is 100% fault in our opinion, and it paid off because they put 100% on that one person. And we've had other cases where there's multiple parties where we do ask the jury to say, okay, this truck crossed the center line and hit this vehicle, but that other party was driving 30 miles over the speed limit, so they wouldn't have even been involved in this collision if they were driving the speed limit. So we asked them to do, in that case, I believe it was like 70-30 or something, and the jury agreed.
So when you settle these types of cases, though, you get the other party to agree to a percentage. Is that kind of how?
Yeah. Frequently, it's us and two or three insurance companies and two or three defense firms, and we're just debating the merits of the case. And many times they'll come to an agreement, because what people don't realize is when you file a claim, even if you don't have a lawyer, let's say for property damage, if there's two companies who aren't sure if they're at fault, they'll arbitrate or mediate that amongst themselves. So they do this behind the scenes all the time. So it's not new to them when it's involving a case where we're representing somebody.
Okay, that makes sense. How often do these go to a jury, these types of multi-vehicle wrecks? Best guess.
Luckily, the vast majority of them settle.
Yeah, even with multi-car wrecks?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Now, a lot of times those will end up in litigation, and you'll have massive mediations to try to determine it. And the tough part from representing the injured parties is, we're all looking at this from the rearview mirror, and it's hard to say who's 70%, who's whatever their percentage is. So ideally they all settle, but they do frequently go to trial. But I would say the vast, vast majority settle because all the parties have an incentive to settle.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it gets more expensive to go to trial, obviously, and more time consuming, and drags everything out and all that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So we do settle most of those, but our firm, has won hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of cases. So if a case needs to go to trial, we're going to do it. We'll do all the detective work that needs to be done leading up to that. And I've found from doing this for over 25 years that if you do all of that work in the beginning, it's easier to resolve it at the end because you're presenting the best case possible for your client. And, you have all the witness statements, as we said earlier, all of the video, and not every law firm is going to do all of that hard work up front.
Right. Understood. Yeah, I agree. That makes sense. All right. Well, thanks for tuning in to Law Talk with Peter Meyer. For more information or to connect with Peter and the team, visit meyerlawfirm.net. And don't forget to like our videos and subscribe. We got lots more great information coming your way. Peter, so great having you here. Thanks so much for all the insight.
Thank you, Kevin. It was fun.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.